April 17, 1943. 23.000 feet above northern France. 10 miles east of Le Havre, the nose of B-17F serial number 4,124,567 call sign Providence's Pride tilted into a thin, brittle sun. Frost rimed the leading edges of the wings like powdered sugar. The 4ITAR 1820S thumped with the steady, confident heartbeat of a machine built to outlast storms. Captain James H. Jimmy Mallory, 28, wore his leather helmet low and his jaw set. His breath fogged the bubble canopy. Beside him, First Lieutenant Harold S. Beck, his co-pilot, watched the sky with the narrow, trained attention of a man who had learned to read threats the way others read maps. You felt the plane before you saw anything, air pressure changing with each climb. The metallic tang of gasoline and oil. The thump of the fuselage as flak disintegrated somewhere below and a distant engine coughed. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Tommy Ruiz, hunched at his waist gun, kept his palms warm on the cold metal of the mount and checked the sights, counting the sweep of enemy fighters on the escort frequency. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Walter Kinsey, glanced at his sextant and pushed a hand through his hair. The bombardier, young Ensign Richard Dickey Hale, had his face almost touching the northern domes as if proximity might coax certainty from the instrument. They were part of the 97th Bomb Group. A loose chain of fortunes and misfortunes strung across the sky in tight formation. Below them, the coastline shrank and the English Channel glittered. A hard-edged strip of blue. Ahead the target, a synthetic oil plant in the Ruhr. A ragged black scar on the map that would draw flak like a hive draws bees. A sharp intonation in the intercom flak. 11 o'clock. Heavy. Lieutenant Beck's voice was clipped but not panicked. Captain Mallory tightened his grip on the control column and felt the subtle, inhuman vibration that meant heat and shell fragments chewing at the air. The formation compressed. Airframes tightening like a school of fish at the shadow of a predator. Then the first kiss of metal, a ricochet up against the tail assembly that sent a jolt down the empennage. The aircraft shuddered. Not enough to alarm yet. The bombardier called. 3 clusters altitude plus effect. More black puffs blossomed below them. Each explosion a hand-shaped shadow reaching up. The fuselage took a shower of grit and glass. Somewhere aft, the thin whine of fabric and cable under stress joined the orchestra of engines and radio static. The German flak was accurate, more accurate than the men on board would have liked to admit, and within minutes a concentrated bracket opened along the flight path. A bright, white column of tracers stitched the sky. A line of B-17s ahead dropped like wounded geese as shells detonated against rivets and plates. From the waist, Sergeant Ruiz shouted over the howl. Fighter at 3 o'clock. The black dot exploded into shape, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 skimming in. Its pilot hunched like a vulture. Cannon barking. Machine gun fire rattled across the fuselage and a spray of glass shattered over the radio operator. Corporal Edward Ned Mullins. He swore. One hand pressed to his face. Blood mixing with the radio static. You could taste the acrid powder of explosive residue as if the burst had been tossed into the cockpit. The right waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Leonard Price, swung his twin .50s toward the attacking fighter and squeezed in a practiced rhythm. The tracers arced and sometimes connected in a physics of luck and gunnery. A Messerschmitt peeled off. Smoking, another dove in from above. Then another. The sky became a cramped, violent theater where men and machines haggled for seconds. Then, at the rear, everything changed. A deep, grinding sound, metal shearing, rolled through the hull like a stomach lurch. Lieutenant Kinsey, standing over a chart, felt it as a physical shove. He turned, eyes wide, and the sight that met him was a raw, impossible geometry. The port side tailplane sheared back, empennage torn, rudder splintered into serrated, fluttering teeth. Half the vertical stabilizer had been ripped away by an anti-aircraft burst or a cannon salvo. Control cables snapped like violin strings. Captain Mallory's hands danced over the wheel. Rudder responsive? He barked. Beck slapped switches. feeling for hydraulic feedback. For the familiarity of resistance that means control. The instruments argued with one another. Yaw indicator flicked. Airspeed steadied but the slipskid needle quivered. The control column vibrated in Mallory's palms as if trying to tell him a different story than his eyes were reading. For a heartbeat the men did nothing but register the impossibility. The sky, which a minute before had been full of orders and mission geometry, went thin and intimate. There was a new sound now, a shuddering howl as wind ripped through the jagged stump where tail fabric and metal had been. Pieces of torn aluminium flapped like broken wings. The rear gunner's voice came over the intercom. Breathless, tail's gone, half of it's gone, Jesus. It's gone, outside. Down below. Luftwaffe ground technicians in an observation post would later swear they had seen the plane flying like a ghost. Half its rear missing. Its silhouette an obscene polo of metal and fabric. But in that moment inside the cockpit, there was only the raw arithmetic of survival, an aircraft designed with redundancy now betrayed by physics. And a crew wrestling with the question that always rose. Unbidden. In such minutes can she bring us home? The engines howled, the fortress, wounded, oscillated. Captain Mallory felt the writing moments through his spine and through fingertips that would not let go. He issued orders calm, precise, and the men complied. Dump non-essential weight. Feather a damaged engine if necessary. Prepare the wounded for ditching procedures. Each voice was a thread, braided now into the single, stubborn will of a crew that refused to become a number. Somewhere in the sky, among the smoking and the tracers, the formation began to split. Providence's pride lurched but held her altitude. For the men aboard, the war contracted to the space between their hands and the yawn of the Atlantic ahead. For the engineers and pilots on the ground who had glimpsed the shredded tail later that day, the sight would become an uncomfortable puzzle. But for now, the puzzle was immediate and intimate. Keep breathing. Keep flying. Keep the fortress in the air. The B-17 bucked again. Harder this time. A sickening dip of the nose followed by a sluggish, wallowing correction. Captain Mallory felt the aircraft trying to decide for itself which way to die. The missing portion of the vertical stabilizer created an asymmetric drag that pulled the tail left. The surviving control surfaces fought back like strained muscles. Assist with trim, Mallory barked, gritting his teeth as he held pressure on the yoke. Lieutenant Beck dropped one hand to the elevator trim wheel, spinning it until his knuckles whitened. The loud, vibrating clatter of the tail section filled every rivet of the fuselage. Through the intercom came the muffled panic of Staff Sergeant Gordon "Gordy" Mills, the tail gunner, who had nearly been thrown sideways when the blast tore open the empennage. He was strapped in, but the wind now punched through the ruptured skin of the aircraft and snapped at him like a living thing. "I can see daylight everywhere back here," Mills shouted over the roar. "Cables are whipping loose, I repeat. We've lost half the damn rudder." Sergeant Ruiz moved aft, steadying himself along the cold interior frame, and saw it. Two metal curled outward, as if peeled back by giant fingers. Insulation blew out in streamers. He grabbed Mills by the shoulder harness and tightened his straps, then fought his way back to the waist compartment, through the nose. Bombardier Hale saw the formation pulling away. They were drifting, unable to hold position. A lonely isolation settled over Providence's pride, the kind of separation every bomber crew feared more than enemy fire. Stragglers drew fighters. 5 o'clock. Low Price called out. 3 BF-109s were curving around in a predatory arc, sunlight flashing against their canopies. Their engines growled as they climbed for the kill. Captain Mallory forced the B-17's nose slightly downward to pick up speed. The fortress responded slowly but enough to complicate the fighter's vector. "Keep 'em off us," Mallory growled. Sergeant Ruiz braced himself at the right waist window, pressed his cheek to the cold metal, and opened fire. His twin .50s boomed like thunder in the thin air, spent casings scattering across the floor. Price joined from the opposite side, the tracers from both guns crossing like fiery knitting needles. For a moment, the sky lit with intersecting streams, bullets slicing into space where fractions of seconds mattered. One Messerschmitt pulled up abruptly, its wingtip smoking. Another pressed in. Cannon fire stitching along the fuselage. A blast rocked the radio compartment. Mullins ducked instinctively as sparks leapt across his equipment. "I'm losing signal strength," he yelled. "Something's hit the transmitter," Beck swore under his breath. "Terrific. Can we at least get IFF?" Mullins tried a different channel. Static swallowed his reply. At the top turret, Technical Sergeant William Draper tracked the nearest 109. Rotating with mechanical precision, he fired a tight, controlled burst that snapped across the enemy's canopy. The fighter jerked away, trailing a thin vapor line, but the Germans weren't giving up. Not when a half-crippled fortress drifted alone. A cannon shell burst against the remaining stabilizer. The aircraft lurched so hard Mallory felt the yoke slam upward into his chest. He exhaled sharply, refusing to give an inch. His arms trembled from the constant force needed to keep the plane level. "Jimmy, we're losing authority." "She's not holding," Beck warned. Mallory forced calm into his voice. "She'll hold as long as we do." He wasn't sure that was true, but it was the only thing he could give his men. From the tail, Mills shouted again, voice cracking. Another hole opened up. "I'm looking at the sky through where the control cables should be, in the cold. Thinner." The fortress groaned. Mallory felt it not in the instruments, but in the bones of the airframe itself. The B-17 was fighting to stay together. He adjusted throttle settings, feathering the number 3 engine slightly to counter the yaw. The asymmetric power curve stabilized them. Barely. Dark smoke drifted from the right wing where a previous hit had ruptured a fuel line. The leak wasn't catastrophic yet, but the shimmering trail of vapor behind them served as an invitation to every German pilot. Then, suddenly, a break. The fighters pulled away, banking sharply to the east. A call had come over their channel: fuel, altitude, rendezvous orders. No one aboard Providence's Pride knew. All they saw were their predators shrinking into dots, but the danger wasn't gone. They were over France. Alone. Low on structural integrity. Minus a significant portion of the tail. And still more than an hour from the English coast, inside the cockpit. Beck stared at the dancing needles on the panel. "Jimmy," he said quietly, "if she drops another few degrees, we'll enter a spin we can't recover." Mallory didn't look up. "Then we won't let her drop." Kinsey stepped into the cockpit, gripping the overhead rail. His face was pale but composed. "If we adjust course 20 degrees north, we can skirt Khan's flak zone." Mallory nodded. "Do it." Kinsey set to work, marking bearings on his chart while the aircraft quivered under him. Every turn felt like wrenching a wounded animal sideways. The men exchanged no illusions. This was no longer a mission, it was a rescue attempt of themselves, of their fortress, of every rivet and cable that still clung to purpose. Wind screamed through the torn tail like a mouth stuck in a perpetual howl. The cold deepened. The sky darkened ahead. They still had to cross the coast, they still had to survive. And no one aboard yet understood what the ground crews and Luftwaffe engineers would later puzzle over for days: how any flying fortress could still remain airborne in this condition. The French countryside unfolded beneath them like a battered quilt, fields sliced into angles, winding roads, villages huddled in quiet clusters. From 17,000 feet, it looked peaceful. But Captain Mallory knew that every mile below was threaded with danger-concealed flak batteries, patrol routes, Luftwaffe forward airfields, and a wounded B-17 flying alone was the most obvious target in the world. The aircraft rattled again as a gust of crosswind caught the torn tail assembly. The remaining stabilizer flexed visibly in unnatural, rubbery motion that made Lieutenant Beck's stomach drop. "Jimmy," Beck said softly, "she's fighting us harder every minute." Mallory's fingers locked around the yoke. "Then fight back harder." It wasn't bravado. It was necessity. The fortress demanded both hands, full strength, and unwavering attention to keep from entering a deadly spin. He could feel the tremors of the airframe like pulse beats. Every vibration meant metal was loosening. Rivets were shifting. Forces were redistributing in ways Boeing engineers had never intended. In the radio compartment, Mullins hunched over the backup transmitter. His left cheek was bandaged from earlier shrapnel, and blood had dried in dark streaks across his collar. He toggled frequencies, hoping for even a whisper of allied chatter. Nothing. Only static. Like wind moving through dead grass. Still nothing. He muttered. I can't raise Thorpe Abbots. I can't raise anyone. Hail. From the nose. Glanced back. We'll hit the coast without warning them. Mullins forced a thin smile. Wouldn't be the first time a fortress limped home unannounced. Kinsey appeared in the compartment doorway, gripping the metal frame as another shudder rolled through the plane. We're 10 minutes from Khan's outer ring. If they spot us, they will. Hagen replied from the ball turret, voice trembling with fatigue. We're flying like a drunk duck with half a tail, and they all knew it. The B-17 yawed left, then right, in small but endless deviations. Mallory corrected constantly, sweating despite the freezing cockpit. Ahead, the coastline shimmered through a veil of high haze. Safety was still miles off, but seeing the grey outline of northern France stirred something small and stubborn inside each man, until the flak started. A black blossom erupted off their port wing close enough to jolt the plane sideways. Price flinched instinctively, grabbing for a support strut. Battery at 9 o'clock, Ruiz shouted. They've got us dialed in. More bursts appeared, dark flowers unfolding around them with terrible precision. Fragments pinged against the fuselage. One shard punched through near the waist section, slicing a clean line through the aluminium skin. Beck winced as another shockwave rocked the controls. Jimmy, we can't take much more of this, we don't have a choice. Mallory hissed. Jaw tight. Another burst closer. Too close. Hale felt the nose bubble vibrate violently as the shockwave slapped against it. The blast seemed to travel through the ribs of the aircraft, rattling bones, hearts, teeth, but somehow, impossibly, the fortress held. Not gracefully, not even adequately. But it held, almost clear. Kinsey murmured, checking his chart with trembling hands. Just a few more miles. Another flak burst detonated behind them, sending a spray of shrapnel through the remnants of the tail. Mills yelped as wind suddenly roared louder. Another gap had opened. He pressed himself deeper into his seat, gripping his twin .50s. Tails shredding, he cried. Oh hell, I can actually see the ground through the back. Beck looked at Mallory. If the stabilizer rips off, we're dead. Mallory's voice was quiet. Then pray it doesn't. The flak tapered off as they finally passed beyond Khan's range. The sky opened, wide and grey. Below them, waves crashed against the chalk cliffs of the French coast. The channel stretched ahead like a cold sheet of steel. They had crossed the worst of the enemy's defenses, but the fortress was dying. Smoke still trailed from the right wing. The fuel leak had grown. The left rudder cable was completely severed. The tail gunner's section was more rare than aircraft now. Fluttering strips of metal whipping behind them. Inside the cockpit, Mallory could feel the yoke softening, less responsive. Like the controls were being swallowed into a void. He knew what that meant. The structure was weakening. The fortress was slowly losing its ability to hold aerodynamic shape. The men sensed it too. The chatter died to a grim, practical silence. Then Mullins' radio crackled. Everyone froze. A faint, broken voice seeped through the static fortress. Identify, repeat. Identify yourself. Mullins slammed the transmit key. This is B-17 Providence's Pride. Returning from raid. We're badly hit, requesting vector and emergency priority. Static. Then the voice again. Providence's Pride. You're far off course. Can you stay airborne? Mullins looked toward the cockpit, eyes heavy. They're asking if we can stay airborne. Mallory didn't hesitate. Tell them yes. Tell them we're coming home. Even if we have to crawl. Mullins transmitted the message. The reply came almost instantly. Providence's Pride. Divert to RAF Warmwell. Shortest runway in range. Emergency crews standing by. Warmwell. A coastal station with minimal facilities. No choice at all. Mallory steadied the shaking aircraft. Eyes fixed on the horizon. Set course. He said. No one spoke. No one needed to. The channel wind hammered the torn tail. The engines labored. And the sky seemed to lean against them with increasing weight. But Providence's pride, half a tail missing. Bleeding fuel. Bracing against physics, kept flying, kept moving, kept refusing to fall. The English coast appeared as a smudge of grey on the horizon, almost indistinguishable from the brooding sky above it. Yet to the men aboard Providence's pride, it looked like salvation itself. The fortress trembled as if aware of how close it was to collapsing. Vibrations rolled through the fuselage in uneven pulses, each one threatening to grow into a catastrophic shudder. Captain Mallory kept both hands clamped on the yoke. His shoulders ached. His fingers were numb. His breath fogged the inside of his mask in shallow bursts. How much longer, he asked quietly. Kinsey checked his map and the faint guidance from the radio beacon. 10 minutes to Warmwell if she holds. If she holds. The words sat heavy in the cockpit. Wind knifed through the ruptured tail section, whipping around Mills like a living creature trying to drag him out into the sky. He tightened every strap he had left. The frame behind him groaned with each passing second. He whispered under his breath, not prayers exactly, but something like them. In the waist compartment, Ruiz and Price exchanged a look. Gunners learned not to talk about fear. But the reality was impossible to ignore. The B-17 felt lighter, looser, as if parts were peeling away mid-flight. Each time Mallory corrected the yaw, the motion took longer to respond. Beck leaned closer to the controls, watching every gauge. The airspeed was dropping, not dangerously, but noticeably. A sign of drag increasing. A sign of structure giving way. Jimmy, he said softly. The tail could go any second. Mallory didn't shift his eyes from the horizon. Then we land before it does. Mullen's radio crackled again, clearer this time. Providence's pride. Warmwell Tower. We have visual on you. Be advised. Your tail is severely compromised. Winds are 12 knots cross from the southwest. Emergency vehicles are ready. Beck exhaled sharply. Crosswind perfect. Ask them for a straight-in approach. Mallory said. Mullins relayed the request. Warmwell Tower came back immediately, cleared for straight-in approach. You'll have the field. The entire airfield had been cleared. Dozens of ground crewmen were already gathering along the runway edges, craning their necks to see the incoming wreck. To them, the silhouette looked impossible, its tail twisted and torn. Half of the vertical stabilizer simply missing. Sheets of metal fluttering behind like feathers ripped from a bird. The fortress dipped suddenly, a low, sinking motion. Slow but unmistakable. Beck's hand shot out. Jimmy, I've got it. Mallory growled, pulling back hard. The yoke resisted for a moment, then responded like an old warhorse staggering to its feet. The aircraft leveled barely, but everyone aboard felt the truth. The tail wasn't just damaged, it was dying. Lowering gear, Beck said. His voice steady despite the tension. He flipped the switch. The landing gear groaned as it dropped, the left wheel hesitating before locking into place with a clunk that echoed through the fuselage. Gear down and locked. Beck confirmed. Flaps, half. Mallory ordered. The flaps extended, a risky maneuver given the structural damage. The extra lift helped stabilize them, but the added drag made the tail jerk violently. Mills screamed as the entire rear section lurched. His seatbelt strained with a sharp snap of tension. Ruiz shouted, "Hold on, Gordy, just a few more seconds." The runway appeared below, long, narrow, slick with coastal mist. Mallory kept the nose high, fighting the yaw left, the sluggish roll right, the constant buffet of a tail that no longer obeyed the laws of aerodynamics. Beck called altitudes 200 feet, 150, 100. The fortress dropped hard. Mallory hauled the yoke back, coaxing the dying aircraft through the last seconds of flight. 70 feet she's stalling, I know. With a final groan like the exhale of a wounded giant, the B-17 leveled just enough for touchdown. The wheels hit the runway with a bone-jarring slam. The landing gear flexed violently. Rubber screeching. The fortress bounced once. Then hit again and this time stayed down. Mallory and Beck braced as the aircraft fishtailed. The missing tail dragging it sideways. Right brake, Beck yelled. Mallory complied. Easing pressure. Trying not to tip the aircraft. The fortress skidded. Tires squealing. A trail of shredded aluminium scraping behind like metallic confetti. For a moment, it seemed certain they would roll, but then, the skid slowed, the yaw eased, the fortress straightened, and finally, mercifully, Providence's pride ground to a halt halfway down the runway. Sputtering. Smoking. But intact. Silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the ticking of cooling engines. Mallory let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Beck slumped back. Eyes closed. Ruiz laughed once, a sharp, disbelieving bark. Mills sagged in the tail. Shaking, emergency crews sprinted toward the aircraft. Their boots pounding the tarmac. One of the ground officers skidded to a stop mid-run. Staring in stunned disbelief at the tail section. Good God, he whispered. How in hell? Because the damage was worse than anyone expected. The left side of the vertical stabilizer was gone entirely. The right side was cracked nearly free. Control cables dangled like snapped veins. The horizontal stabilizer was bent at an angle that defied flight. The rear fuselage had peeled open in long, jagged gaps. No engineer would have believed this plane could fly, but it had, and it had brought her men home. Inside the cockpit, Mallory removed his oxygen mask and leaned back slowly. We made it, he said. Beck let out an exhausted chuckle. Against every law of physics, Mallory looked at the smoking wing, the shredded tail, the broken ribs of his ship. Gentlemen, he whispered, almost reverently, never doubt a flying fortress. The moment the engines powered down, a strange quiet settled over Providence's pride, an almost sacred silence. As if the aircraft was finally allowed to rest after holding itself together through sheer will. The props slowed to a stop with uneven, shuddering rotations. A faint hiss of escaping fuel drifted through the misty air. The first ladder clanged against the forward hatch. Mallory pushed himself upright, legs trembling. When he stepped into the doorway, the cold English wind hit him like a wave, and so did the sight of dozens of airmen, mechanics, and officers gathered around his bomber, all frozen in place. Their faces were masks of disbelief. An RAF flight lieutenant took a hesitant step forward. Eyes locked on the tail. Captain, how in God's name did you keep her airborne? Mallory looked back, and even he had to blink at the sight. The tail section looked as if a giant had taken a bite out of it. Aluminium ribs twisted outward in sharp, fractured curves. The remains of the vertical stabilizer flapped weakly in the breeze. Control cables hung loose like snapped tendons. The gunner's enclosure was bent open so widely that Mills, climbing out with the help of two medics, appeared to be stepping from the wreckage of a demolished building rather than an aircraft that had just landed under control. One of the ground crewmen shook his head in awe. I've seen forts limp home, but never like this. Lieutenant Beck descended the ladder next, boots hitting the tarmac. His face was pale, streaked with sweat and frost. Medics rushed toward him, but he waved them off with a tired smirk. Check the tail first. It needs help more than we do. Ruiz and Price emerged from the waste hatch, leaning on each other. Their uniforms were streaked with soot and insulation dust. They stared at their own aircraft as if seeing it for the first time. Mother Mary, Price muttered. We were flying that. Ruiz let out a shaky laugh. No wonder she was screaming the whole way. Hagen crawled from the ball turret, stiff and sore, but uninjured. Mullins followed, clutching his radio headset as if it were a sacred relic. Hale stepped out last from the nose compartment, pausing beside Mallory as the group of engineers and officers closed in. A senior RAF engineer, grey-haired, stern, with a slide rule tucked into his belt, circulated around the tail section, taking in every warped rivet, every twisted frame. Finally he turned to the crew, his expression somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "This aircraft should not have remained stable in flight," he said. "One more degree of yaw, and she would have entered a terminal spin. Your stabilizer is well. It's not a stabilizer anymore. It's a suggestion of one." Another engineer joined him. "And these cables severed completely. Gentlemen, you weren't flying with full rudder authority. Half your control system was gone." Beck raised a brow. "Half felt like 7/8ths. The engineers ushered the men closer so they could see the damage from their perspective. Up close, it was even worse, gaping holes large enough to crawl through. Jagged tears along the fuselage. The skin of the aircraft peeled back like ruptured armor." Kinsey shook his head slowly. "We crossed the channel like this." Ruiz clapped him on the shoulder. "Crossed it. Hell, we fought off fighters and flew through flak like this." Several RAF mechanics exchanged looks of stunned respect. One of the younger engineers, eyes wide, murmured, "I'd love to know what kind of magic holds a fortress together after all this." Mallory answered for him, voice slow but certain, "Courage, rivets, and a little luck." Behind them, a crane truck pulled up, ready to support the failing tail. The structure groaned as the weight shifted, prompting several mechanics to flinch and step back. "She's gonna come off." One muttered, "Not today, she won't." Another replied, adjusting the hoist. Photographers arrived next. RAF, WASAF. Local war correspondents drawn by the radio chatter about a half-tailed miracle bomber. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, capturing the mangled tail, the shredded wing root, the streaks of soot, the bullet holes peppering the fuselage like stars against dusk. One photographer, lowering his camera, whispered, "The folks back home aren't going to believe this." Mallory turned toward him. "They will when they see the pictures." As more airmen gathered, conversations rippled through the crowd. "How did they steer it? Should have spun out the moment the stabilizer went. Never seen anything like it. That thing was still flying. An RAF captain approached Mallory and extended a hand. "Captain Mallory, your landing was a miracle." Mallory shook his hand. "It wasn't a miracle. It was the fortress doing what she was built to do." The captain glanced back at the torn aircraft. Skepticism clear. "I've read the design specs but I didn't know they meant this." Mallory smiled faintly. "Neither did we." As the crew was led toward the infirmary for evaluation, a final glance passed among them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the impossible journey they'd survived. Mills, the tail gunner, paused and looked back at the ruin of his post. "She brought us home," he whispered. "Even with half her damn tail missing, she brought us home." And though none of the men could have known it yet, the sight of Providence's pride would become one of the most studied cases in wartime aviation, an example Luftwaffe engineers would later analyze. Baffled by how an aircraft so torn and beaten could still fly, still fight, and still return its crew safely to English soil. For the moment, though, it was enough simply to breathe English air again, enough to know they had survived what no one believed survivable, and enough to know that their flying fortress had lived up to her name in every way that mattered.